like to turn to Genesis chapter 22. We'll read the first 13 verses. Genesis chapter 22. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, saddled his ass, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. This is the most well-known episode of Abraham's life, and is the climax of what began over 25 years ago, back in chapter 12, when Abraham was 75 years old. And what is recorded here is without precedent or parallel in the Old Testament. It is certainly one of the most profound of all biblical accounts. It's an event in the life of Abraham, a test from God. We read in verse 1, God did tempt, or God did try, or test Abraham. So what is before us is an account of human faith. It's a powerful example of faith and victory in God. It's made mention of in Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. So this is a trial, a proving of Abraham's faith. It is a picture of many things. It is a picture of personal willingness. It is a picture of surrender. It is a picture of obedience to God. Certainly a picture in perseverance in the will of God. It's a record of God's providence. It's a record of the faithfulness of God, the ability of God. An amazing illustration of the love and care of God for Abraham and for Isaac. And of course, it's a remarkable foreshadowing of God sending forth His own Son to Calvary. So there are many ways to approach what we read here in Genesis chapter 22. And we've preached many messages from this account. But for the development of the thought of the message today, I call your attention to verse 13. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold. This is the climax of the account. Everything in the chapter prior to this is leading up to behold. Behold. Everything is moving in that direction. Behold. Now, the word behold throughout Scripture is indicative of something extraordinary, something momentous. It's a word of exclamation. It's a word of wonder. So Abraham comes to this place. He lifts up his eyes, and behold, behind him there is a ram caught in a thicket. Behold, there is God's provision for Abraham. There it is. Behold. A word of exclamation. A word of wonder. Now the verses prior to this reveal how Abraham and Isaac got to this point of behold. Behold. And that's our subject. The journey to behold. The journey to behold. How we get there. We live in a world that's filled with trouble. The world has always been filled with trouble. Suffering, adversities, problems, distresses of all sorts, disturbances, innumerable needs. A world where there's one obstacle after another. When you think, well, this is the last obstacle I got to get through. No, there'll be another one. There'll be another one. We live in a world that is a very unsettled place spiritually. But as children of God, saved by the amazing grace of God, our lives ought to be marked by and behold. Our lives ought to be marked by wonders. Behold. Behold. Our lives ought to be filled with exclamation and wonder concerning God. So how do we get there? How do we experience behold? Let's first look at the setting of the text. Again, back in Genesis 12, we see Abraham at the age of 75, being called of God to leave his homeland. No, this is where you've lived all your life, but Abraham, move. 75 years old. And he's told to go into a land that he knew nothing of. We read in verse 1 of Genesis 12, "Get thee out of thy country." Now, I want to pay attention to certain phrases here. Thy country. And from thy kindred. So he's leaving his country, his kindred. and from thy father's house, thy country, thy kindred, thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. It was a call of separation from the ties of natural man. His country, his kindred, his father's house. Connected to this was a promise concerning something that God would do. And we read of that in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. Verse 4, we read of the response of Abraham. And Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Abraham, as the Lord had spoken. That's an act of faith on the part of Abraham. And it's referred to again in Hebrews 11, verse 8. Abraham leaves his homeland. Why? Because God said so. That was the only reason. God said so. In Genesis 15, verse 1, God again appeared to Abraham. And in that appearance, He revealed to Abraham that he was everything he needed. He said, Abraham, I'm thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Abraham needed that reminder. I'm everything you need, Abraham. Reading on in chapter 15, God promised him a son. The years would pass, and Abraham and Sarah still had no children. And in Genesis 17, Abraham is 99 years old. 24 years have passed since Genesis 12. And God promises him that in the next year, so now we're 25 years, he and Sarah would have a son. And they were to name him Isaac. And Abraham and Sarah had waited day after day for 25 years for the promise of God. And in Genesis 21, verses 2 and 3, we read of the birth of Isaac. And you can imagine the joy. 25 years of waiting. You can imagine the joy that filled the hearts of Abraham and Sarah when Isaac was born. And oh, how they loved Isaac. 25 years between Genesis 12 and the birth of Isaac. And there very well could be 20 years between Isaac's birth and our text. So coming to our text, we read, and it came to pass after these things. That's quite a statement. It came to pass after these things. All these things. After 25 years of waiting for the promise of a son, after experiencing the joy of his birth, and after years of child rearing, we read these words. And God did tempt or test Abraham. And what follows, verse 2, Genesis 22 and 2, take now thy son, thine only son, thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. He's your son. He's your only son. And you love him. And go into the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering. Abraham knew all about burnt offerings. He'd offered many of them. He knew exactly what God was talking about. Upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. He says, when you get there, I'll let you know. You head that direction, and when you get there, I'll let you know. So, there is a call for Abraham to do something that is contrary to natural affection, contrary to human reasoning. It was a test. It was a test of his love for and his faith in the Lord. It was a test to reveal the chief affection of his heart. Is it Isaac or God? It's really a test to see just how far Abraham was willing to go for God. We need to ask ourselves that question. How far am I willing to go for God? This was a test that would reveal just how far Abraham was willing to go for God. It would be the ultimate test in Abraham's life. His entire life is now interrupted by this demand from God. Take now thine son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him for burnt offering. That is, Abraham, take your miraculously born son, your supernaturally given son, your promised and beloved son, and offer him for a burnt offering. This demand is now placed upon Abraham according to God's timing. It was not meant to harm Abraham or Isaac. It was not meant to destroy Abraham. And so it is with all of God's demands. God doesn't tell you to do something to cause you harm. God doesn't tell you to do something to destroy you and to ruin your life. That's how people act. That's not God. But this test was sent by God out of love to Abraham. It was sent to challenge him. It was sent to help him, to strengthen, to better him, and to further teach him concerning the greatness of God. That's still so today. So the setting of the text is Abraham face to face with something unexpected. Abraham would have never expected God to tell him, offer your son as a burnt offering. This is the unexpected. We all will have to deal with the unexpected. Not to this degree. But there's always the unexpected. that which you did not plan for, the inconceivable, the unspeakable, the incomprehensible, is now laid upon him. Abraham would never understand. Why? Why would God tell me to do this? You'll never understand that. Again, it was meant to give Abraham a greater and even more personal knowledge and experience of God. I believe that's still the case today. That's why God lays demands upon us, to give us a greater knowledge of Him, to give us a greater experience of God, to bring us to the point, behold, behold. He put this demand upon him to cause Abraham to experience a greater nearness to God, a greater love for God. Our God is great in the way He directs trials into our lives. Then we want to look at Abraham's journey to behold. And Abraham, verse 13, lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold. What got him to this point? And behold, something wonderful. And behold, God's miraculous provision. What got Abraham to this point was a life, a walk, an adventure of faith and love for the Lord. My point is, there was a path to behold. There was a path he had to take to get there, to behold something wonderful. There's a path. So let's look at this. In verse 1, God called Abraham by name. God was reality. God was relevant in the life of Abraham. He said unto him in verse 1, Abraham. God talked to Abraham. And Abraham was very familiar with the voice of God. If you and I are going to live a life marked by behold, we need to be familiar with the voice of God. We read in Genesis 12, verse 1, the Lord had said unto Abram. And in chapter 12, verse 7, and the Lord appeared unto Abram and said. In Genesis 13 and 14, and the Lord said unto Abram. And in Genesis 15, verse 1, the word of the Lord came unto Abram. And in Genesis 17:1, the Lord appeared unto Abraham, or unto Abram, and said. And in Genesis 17:3, and God talked with him. And in Genesis 18, verse 1, and the Lord appeared unto him. And in Genesis 18:13, and the Lord said unto Abraham. And in chapter 21, verse 12, and God said unto Abraham. The point is, Abraham knew God. Abraham had experienced God in his daily life. He had the blessed assurance that he belonged to God. He had the blessed assurance that God loved him and that God was faithful and that God was able. He had the assurance that God did what was best for him. And that God had a plan for his life. And that God was in absolute control of all things. Abraham knew that. He experienced it from day to day. This is moving in the direction of behold. Behold. Abraham knew God. He was also sensitive and available to God. Verse 1, God said unto him, Abraham. He knows that voice. He's heard it before. And he said, Behold, here I am. Abraham heard. Abraham knew that voice. And immediately there's a response. A response of availability. Here I am. A response of readiness. A response of willingness and submission on Abraham's part. Abraham gives no excuses. He gives no reasons why he can't do what God's telling him to do. God speaks, and Abraham's there. He's available. What this means is, when Abraham said, Here I am, God had Abraham's attention. God had Abraham's attention. God doesn't have the attention of many of His people. Doesn't always have our attention. God had Abraham's attention. Does God have our attention? I sometimes wonder what it would take for God to get the attention of some folks. God can get your attention. He can get it right now. But we ought to live our lives with God having our attention. Abraham responds, Here I am. Lord, you speak. Here I am. These are words of sincerity. Again, all of this is moving in the direction of behold. A lot of people want to live in that realm. Behold! I want to see the wonders and the miracles of God. But they don't want God to have their attention. Well, that's how you get to behold. That's part of it. God having our attention. Thirdly, we see that he was submissive and obedient to God's call. In verse 2, we read again of God's command to Abraham. And again, notice some things. Take now. 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 Well, God, I've got some other things to do. Now. Take now thy son. Thy son. Thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. This is a startling demand. Unexpected. This is not something you can plan for. Many times in life, things will happen that you didn't plan for. That's life. Abraham would have never expected such a demand from God. Abraham knew that it was God, when all hope was gone, who miraculously and graciously and lovingly gave him Isaac. And he knew that God's promise for his own future was connected to Isaac. And now God is commanding Isaac to offer Isaac in sacrifice to the Lord. This goes against every fiber of Abraham's being. Abraham would have never imagined being faced with such a demand from God. But one evening, in a moment, there it was. Take now thy son. Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him for a burnt offering. Never would he have expected this. Never would he have planned this. In verse 3, we read of Abraham's response to this unexpected turn of events. This incomprehensible demand that was laid upon him. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, made all the preparations to do what God was telling him to do. As you read Genesis 22, the record is silent about the emotions of Abraham. But we only have to put ourselves in the place of Abraham to sense what he felt. Can you imagine the emotions, the struggles that Abraham had that day? Without a doubt, there was much turmoil in heart and mind. I got to believe that there was much wrestling. But regardless of the emotions and struggles not recorded, here's what we read. And Abraham rose up early in the morning to do exactly what God told him to do. Abraham would have to overcome all of his emotions and all of his struggles. We are told there that he prepared his mule for the journey. Imagine what he felt as he's making these preparations. He went out, it says he clave the wood. He cut the wood necessary for the burnt offering. Can you imagine? Cutting the wood that you're going to lay your son upon. He gathered 2 of his servants, and he gathered Isaac. All the thoughts that must have gone through his mind. No doubt his thoughts would go back to the day that Isaac was born. His thoughts would go back to, before that, God's promise and all the years that Abraham and Sarah waited for the promise. The emotions and the struggles he must have felt. But there he is, submissive and obedient to the call of God. Everything is moving in the direction of behold. Behold. That morning, Abraham steps out with God. Regardless of the emotions and the struggles that were confronting Abraham, he rose up early in the morning, and it says he went unto the place which God had told him. He steps out with God. From verse 4, we learn that it was a 3-day journey. Imagine that. 3 days to think. 3 days to think about what God is telling him. 3 days to talk yourself out of going through with this. I imagine these were the longest 3 days of Abraham's life. Abraham began and he continued the journey with these words etched upon his heart. Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him a burnt offering. This was not an easy 3 days. We're not told what Abraham felt, but you and I can only imagine. There is Abraham. He's on an unexpected journey. But he's on it with God. That makes all the difference in the world. For 3 days, no doubt difficult and trying days, days of intense spiritual warfare, Abraham just keeps moving in the direction of God's leading. And he remained sensitive to God's voice. And he remained available, and he remained ready and willing and submissive to God. And he just kept pressing on, overcoming all the unrecorded emotions and struggles, realizing the power and the faithfulness and the love of God. What kept Abraham going? Energized by faith in God. That's what keeps him moving. And after 3 days, Abraham looked and he saw the place. How did he know? Well, it doesn't tell us, but God said, Abraham, there it is. This is the place. This is where I want you to offer Isaac. Upon arriving at the God-appointed place, Abraham says to his servants in verse 5, you watch the mule, and I and Isaac are going to go and worship. We're going to go and worship. And then he said, and come again to you. That's where his faith is. And come again to you. Those were words of hope. Those were words of faith. Words of deep inner trust in God. In spite of the depth and the array of emotions and struggles, Abraham was expecting God to do the miraculous. From Hebrews 11, verse 19, we see that Abraham fully expected to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. But he also believed that God was able to raise him up. That God would resurrect Isaac. That's faith. Up to this point, Genesis 22, there's no record of God raising anyone to life. Abraham believed what was unheard of. Abraham believed that God could and would do what was unheard of. In verse 6, Abraham and his son Isaac are walking up the mountain. Isaac is carrying the wood. Abraham is carrying the knife and the means to start a fire. As they walk up that mountain, Abraham is embracing the faithfulness, the ability, the love of God. And in so doing, he's finding strength to continue on. In verse 7, Isaac asks his father a question, "Where's the lamb?" for a burnt offering. And Abraham offers a very confident response to his son's question, verse 8. "My son, God will provide Himself a lamb for the burnt offering." God will provide. And behold, when they got there, there's a ram caught in a thicket. My son, God will. This is more than God can. He says, God will. God will. This is faith. This is assurance. This is conviction. And then we read, so they went both of them together. And we've preached on that in the past. God will so. God will so. You keep going because God will. So you see them, Abraham and Isaac, embracing the faithfulness and the ability and the love of God. This is the path to behold. We read in verse 9, Abraham and Isaac arrive at the place where Abraham was to offer Isaac. And we read, and Abraham built an altar there. Again, imagine the depth and the array of emotions and struggles as Abraham built that altar. But as he builds that altar, Abraham is embracing the faithfulness and the ability and the love of God. That's what he's embracing, and that's what enabled him to build that altar. It says he built an altar there. And then it says he laid the wood in order, just as he had done many times before, offering offerings. And bound Isaac his son. Can you imagine? And bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. In each and every one of those acts, building the altar, laying the wood in order, binding Isaac, laying Isaac upon the altar, in each of those, Abraham is embracing the faithfulness, the ability, and the love of God. He can't comprehend what God is telling him to do, but he's embracing God. Again, it's whom? Whom? This is the path to behold. Then we read the inconceivable words of verse 10. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And there he is, uplifted knife in hand. Abraham is willing to go all the way. He's willing to forsake all for God. In verse 11, There came a voice from heaven. That's why you need to be familiar with this voice. It'll save your life. It'll keep you from doing some things. And because Abraham was so determined to carry out God's instruction, God called him by his name twice. He didn't do that in verse 1. He only did once. But because Abraham was so determined, he said, Abraham! Abraham! He knew that voice. And again, what was Abraham's response? Here am I. Here am I. We must never get away from that. Here am I. Always available for God. Always willing for God. Always ready. In spite of the unrecorded emotions and struggles that Abraham had experienced, he's still sensitive to God. Still sensitive to God's voice. Still available, still ready, still willing for God. This is the path. This is what will bring you to behold the wonders of God, the provision of God. From verse 12, we see that this act was a manifestation that Abraham had a deep reverence for God. His reverence for God was greater and more powerful than all the emotions he was feeling and all the struggles. God gives us emotions. Don't let your emotions get in the way of what God is telling you to do. You can't use that as an excuse. But in spite of the emotions, in spite of the struggles, you just keep believing. You stay ready and willing to do what God said. And eventually, you'll get to verse 13. And behold, there it is. God's provision. You read verses 13 and 14, and we see the joy that overflowed in the soul of Abraham. Reading on in verses 15 through 18, there's spiritual growth. There's deeper insight into the person and promises of God. In verse 19 we read, so Abraham returned unto his young men. And oh, the joy. And oh, what Abraham could tell them. What Abraham could tell them. And oh, what we could tell people if we just obeyed God. Just do what God says. You'd be amazed at what you'll behold. You'll be amazed at the wonder of God. In closing, we learn from this that unexpected, inconceivable, incomprehensible events can come into our lives at any time or place. That which is beyond human reason can come upon us. And the best way to be prepared for these is to have a trust-filled relationship with God. To just trust God. To be in tune to the voice of God. To be available to God. To be ready. To be willing before God. And then when these unexpected times come into our lives, we just need the resolute assurance that God is who and what He says He is. That's faith. Embrace the faithfulness of God. Embrace the ability and the love of God. That'll get you over the emotions and the struggles. Far too many times we embrace our emotions and our struggles. We need to embrace the faithfulness and the ability and the love of God. And then, like Abraham, just rise and obey God. Oh, that we would just learn to obey God. Just do what He says, when He says it. Our lives would be so blessed. And when it does not make sense, and when it goes against all your natural affections, just keep moving along with God. Do not let anything stop you from the blessing of behold. There is a path that leads to behold. Oh, that we be on that path. Behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket. Do you realize how many rams in a thicket we have missed in our lives? Because we didn't follow God. You follow God, and you're going to run into God's provision for you. That's what that ram caught in the thicket was. That was God's provision for Abraham and Isaac. And if we just do what God says, you'll find yourself in the place of God's provision. But here's how it goes today, and we'll close. God comes to you and says, go. Well, God, you're going to have to tell me everything that's going to happen on the way there. You're telling me to kill my son, offer him for a burnt offering. Lord, if you want me to do that, you're going to have to show me your provision. I want to see the ram caught in the thicket before I get there. That's not how it works. But that's how we want it to work. I got to see the ram caught in a thicket before I get there. No, you'll see it when you get there. And you got to follow God to get there. And that's where so many fall short. They will not follow God because God hasn't told them, when you get to this point, you will have $110,000. Oh, okay. Off you go. But God doesn't show us those things. You just do what I say, and when you need it, behold, there it is. Because you followed God. What a life. What a wonderful life that we have to live. Brother Dave, if you'll come and lead us in verse song. Let's all